Well, hello, class. I am. How did classical liberalism respond to competing ideologies? So we're moving into chapter 6, even though a lot of this content is still found within the confines of chapter 4. We're going to be moving into the chapter 6 assignment at this point. Now, what I'm going to do with these assignments or with these lessons is that um, I'm going to kind of go through them, glean through them, probably not spend as much time on them as I would normally do in a classroom setting, but nonetheless, have some fun with it. As it says here, classical liberalism was meant to be a movement towards freedom in society, to break with the confines of old, to allow people to achieve what is in their best or own best interest with little interference from government. Sounds great, doesn't it? Now, if you want to spend a few minutes learning about how somebody can eat hot dogs very quickly, you can go ahead and do that. So the whole reason I put this video on here is that you can eat lots of hot dogs in a very small period of time, but should you? Question is, how is Nathan's hot dog eating event a metaphor or a bundle of metaphors for what was wrong with classical liberalism? I think the thinking of that was, yeah, you can make lots of money, but should you make as much money as you can at the expense of others? It's that whole idea about greed, so to speak. So, a question for inquiry is, why did ideologies develop in opposition? The whole theme of chapter 4 is, why did some of these ideologies like socialism, communism, etc., evolve out of classical liberalism or in response to classical liberalism? And like I said, if you've looked at those other slides in this chapter 4, slideshow, uh, we have gone over some of those groups, ranging from the Luddites to the Chartists, eventually to the communists, the socialists, utopians, um, movements like feminism, etc. So classical liberalism and the Industrial Revolution transformed Western society, a society based on agriculture and class separation, centered on your station, your place, and became a society based on industry, emergence of the middle class, laissez-faire government, and the pursuit of industrial efficiency. Ruling elite that emerged, the factory owners and entrepreneurs, the so-called reshuffling of the deck that I talk about, and flourished under classical liberalism may have lived more democratically than the old ruling elite, but the new ideology of laissez-faire capitalism was only concerned with two things: efficiency and the accumulation of wealth. And those goals were considered more important, essentially, than equality. So, what were the problems of classical liberalism? Well, huge companies took over and small companies were no longer competitive. That formed monopolies. And when there's monopolies, then you have the absence of competition. You can raise prices. You can pay your workers a lot less. And so ultimately, it hurts a lot of people over time. Huge monopolies that were formed had so much power that they can influence the government officials to pass laws that were in their interest. So um, eventually became kind of a form of cronyism or corporate welfare, in which these huge companies would arrange special business deals with governments in order to make even more money at the expense of competition, at the expense of the worker. You still see a lot of this today, by the way. Most of the wealth was in the hands of very few wealthy people, the so-called robber barons. And as you can see, there's a link to a video on the robber barons there if you'd like to look at that. For wages and working conditions, environmental concerns, pollution, living conditions, etc. And government had no responsibilities. Okay, people were supposed to look out for themselves. But the problem was when you were in a position of power, you could consolidate that over time and become even more powerful at the expense of people that didn't have that type of power. Not all people saw the Industrial Revolution and classical liberalism as positive developments. Obviously, now, culminating activity of Chapter 4, you looked at some of the areas that progressed or changed from the early parts of the Industrial Revolution to the latter parts of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and you had to identify if that was progress or decline or status quo. Okay, once again, video clips that you can look at. I'll click on it, but I won't show the whole thing. It'll click a cartoon. You can look at, try to analyze, etc. So the late 18th century, well, a little bit earlier in England, uh, late 18th, early 19th or 1900s in North America, you start seeing the emergence of an ideology called welfare capitalism. And welfare capitalism is essentially a type of modern liberalism in which um, the, the companies and now governments will step in to protect the rights of workers. Okay, you don't have the whole welfare state at this position or at this point, but there is still some government intervention to protect the rights of workers. So some classical liberals gradually came to see the merits of some of their opponents' views and modified some of their values and beliefs. You can tell how much I love the word some. Rather grudgingly, classical liberals began to recognize that some changes were necessary. The basic premise for these modifications was an acceptance of the fact that those who believed in the pursuit of industrial efficiency, the so-called robber barons or laissez-faire capitalists, needed to develop a social conscience and more concern for the equality rights of workers. In other words, you can make money, but at the same time, do not completely exploit your workers because they're in a position of vulnerability. So we have this term welfare capitalism system, classical liberalism combined with government legislation to give workers protection. So better wages, better working conditions, better treatment. Okay, but we don't have the full-on welfare state that occurs a little while later. Limited working hours, minimum wage, perhaps a pension, maybe a medical plan, etc. So this welfare capitalism was prevalent in the United States in the early part of the 1900s. It eventually evolved a little bit further into the welfare state, like you see in our own country, Canada, Western Europe, the United States to a certain extent today. So examples of welfare capitalism occurred much earlier in England. And like I said, things like this occurred in England quite a bit sooner than the United States, usually a generation or two. So you see the Factory Acts passed in the early 1800s. You can refer to your worksheet on the subsequent Factory Acts, Mines Acts, protection of workers, protection of women, protection of children. These are all examples of welfare capitalism. And like I said, this occurred in England much earlier than it did ultimately in the United States and Canada. All right, once again, in the United States, you have the first half of the 20th century leading to World War I. The US is dealing with complications of open capitalism. Policies could be seen as a shift left, which means more government intervention, or right, less government intervention during the first half of the 20th century. Here are some major issues seen between labor unions and workers' rights. So this process or change from just complete laissez-faire capitalism to a welfare capitalist state was not always easy. There were obviously some struggles from some issues. Like I said, in the United States, you had an American response to welfare capitalism. In America, the term welfare capitalism referred to workplace initiatives by industrialists. It was an attempt to fight off labor unions that had become more prevalent in Europe. Okay, like I said, kind of like the deal that the British lawmakers made to stop the Chartists almost 100 years prior. In the rest of the industrial world, however, welfare capitalism referred to the classical liberal economic, I got to move my thing around, system combined with government legislation to give worker protections such as limited working hours, minimum wage, and safety net. In Europe and Canada, welfare capitalism referred to the classical liberal economic system combined with a government that used legislation to give workers protections. Okay, and I'm repeating myself here, but welfare capitalism was about protecting the rights of workers so that they wouldn't be completely exploited by the factory owners. Okay, there were authors that were writing books at the turn of the 20th century that were talking about this issue, this exploitation of workers. And one of these authors was a guy by the name of Upton Sinclair. And he wrote a book called The Jungle. And I'm going to share this video with you. And like I said, uh, I'll play it right now. If you want to watch it, you can watch it. If not, you can fast forward over it. But nonetheless, very well made or well written book that dealt with the treatment of workers in these meat packing plants at the turn of the century. So here it goes. Anyhow, you can watch the rest of that just watching the Google Slides. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, and you can kind of get the literary analogies and metaphors from watching this clip, but uh, the worker in a lot of these factories was completely exploited. They were mistreated, and the author Upton Sinclair was trying to, um, make people aware of that. There's another video here called the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. You can click on that link right here. And it talks about the manipulation and mistreatment of factory workers at early 1900s shirt factory in New York, where eventually there was a fire and a number of young ladies were killed because there were absolutely no safety measures at all in this factory. So have a look at that clip. It's a pretty good case study as far as the mistreatment of workers in early 20th century the United States. Once again, I'm not going to read all this, but this is very similar in some ways to what happened in Canada with the Winnipeg General Strike. Of course, when workers are rising up and wanting to form unions, um, the factory owners are not going to like that, and they're going to try any way possible to prevent unions from organizing. And so this particular example, they wanted to stop the union from organizing. They would bring out these armed thugs, sometimes in order to intimidate the workers not to form unions. And so, as you can see in this example, in 1892, a guy by the name of Frick, and this will be in your textbook, one of the workers under Andrew Carnegie, wanted to protect profits. So he stopped negotiations with the union, slashed wages, evicted workers from their company homes. When workers started to strike, Frick brought in hired thugs called Pinkertons. You might know Pinkertons from history. They were kind of like for private hire lawmen that would come in and you're kind of like bounty hunters. Anyways, so there's that. So this is a slide that just talks about all the different ideologies that evolved in response to classical liberalism in the 19th century. You have classical liberalism initially, how classical conservatism reacted against classical liberalism. You have utopian socialism. I think of Robert Owen, New Lanark, New Harmony. Make sure you watch those clips on that. Karl Marx and communism, of course, came in response to classical liberalism. When I think of democratic socialism, I think of Tommy Douglas, etc. Progressivism, the whole term progressivism just means using the power of government in order to bring about change. Okay, legislation, shift left. Okay, we're going to use government in order to make things more equal for everybody. Okay, there were a number of movements also that came in response to classical liberalism. You have the Luddites, didn't like the change, wanted to go back in time. You had the Chartists who wanted more democratic rights. Ultimately, they failed too. You have the rise of feminism, eventually, with equal rights, equal voting, um, job opportunities, etc. You have the suffrage movement, voting rights for not just wealthy white men, but basically anybody that's 18 and over. Eventually, anybody that's a citizen of a country can vote. The rise of labor, standard unions, the protection of workers, human rights in general, treatment of all people equally. And like I said, I just talked about welfare capitalism, and then eventually, like I said, the welfare state. So how do we measure progress? And that was the last question on the chapter 4 worksheet. Things like the role of women. Okay, how did the role of women change from the early part of the Industrial Revolution to the latter part? And then get specific with that. Maybe the rights of workers. Okay, what rights did workers have at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution to the end? The conditions of the cities, how bad they were at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution when there was just this huge flux of people coming in. How did that change over time? How did infrastructure develop, get better, and all that? Education. Who was providing education? Who had access to education? Okay. Other things, the suffrage movement, the franchise. Okay, who was allowed to vote? Who could vote? What were the criteria of voting, etc. And then this whole idea of egalitarianism. Was everyone equal in opportunity, or was everyone equal in outcome? Okay, and that's a continuing argument that people that believe in capitalism believe in the equality of opportunity, whereas someone that's more collective in nature would have more of an equality of outcome. Maybe another measure of progress would be life expectancy. Did life expectancy go up? What were some of the factors? How about population? Did that increase over time? Why? All right. So I've talked about progressivism, and like I said, progressivism is using the power of government to bring about more equality. Okay, when we think of early 20th century progressivism, we think of people like Theodore Roosevelt and, uh, and presidents like that. And like I said, I don't really feel like reading every one of these slides, but one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt did is that he would step in and actually protect the rights of workers. He would use the power of government to bring about more equality. Now, he wasn't a proponent of the welfare state. He didn't want to give out handouts. He just wanted to give people opportunity. Okay, so if you work in a position, you're going to have opportunity to be successful, but it's still going to be up to you to work hard and be innovative and account for yourself, so to speak. So an example of that would be the so-called square deal. Now we're going to learn about a distant cousin or relative of Teddy, and that will be Franklin Roosevelt a little bit later. And he has something called a New Deal. Do not be confused between the two deals. I think they stole a little bit from the square deal to make the New Deal, but the original deal was the square deal. Okay. And instead of me talking about it, I'll show you a video clip, or you can watch the video clip on this square deal. Giving rights to workers, giving opportunities to workers, not allowing the businesses, when they have workers in a position of disadvantage, to completely manipulate them. All right. So like I said, here's the video clip that deals with this square deal. And like I said, you can watch that video on your own. Um, Anyways, well, maybe I will play it. I'm going to speed up this. Oh, by the way, if you want to speed up your videos, and I do this all the time, is I'll turn on the subtitles and I'll turn it to like 1.5 and I'll play it. And I still get the information. And if the subtitles are on, for the most part, I still get what they're saying. It's just that I get through the video a lot quicker. Just a kind of a cheat code. Now, some of those individuals that they just mentioned, the people that were poor and people that were against them would refer to those individuals as robber barons. Whereas the people that would support those type of individuals, they say, well, they were able to kind of get up off the ground and do the work on their own, become wealthy, independently wealthy. They are captains of industry. So it's all about perspective, right? See, once again, he's using the power of government in order to bring about more equality. It's kind of interesting when you contrast this event with the Winnipeg General Strike. Seems like the people that ran the industries and companies were successful at the expense of the workers, whereas um, this event that happened earlier, um, the workers were actually able to win versus the owners of the industry. Now, one of the factors that might have been involved there was, World War One, and then Russia turning into a communist country, and there was that anti-communist sentiment that was prevalent in North America, post World War One. All right. So, anyways, Roosevelt was a president in the early 1900s. He actually tried to run again for president in 1912, but was not successful, being one of the only third party candidates to run an actual campaign that threatened to win the presidency. But he wasn't able to win at that point. Talks about how the president, this time the guy that succeeded Roosevelt, that would be Taft, tried to break up these trust companies, these huge conglomerates. Okay, and so 1911, President Taft used the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after, an example, John D. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil. It was deemed as a monopoly and it was eventually broken up to 34 individual companies. So that would be an example of progressivism. Okay, another act that was passed by the president at that time was the Clayton Act, legitimized unions, boycotts, strikes, picketings, and collective bargaining. Now, if you don't know what those terms mean, you should know what a strike is. You should know what boycott is. Collective bargaining, that's when a union will bargain together to try to get one agreement. The thinking is if you bargain together, you have a lot more strength in numbers, so to speak. So that would be an example of a move from classical liberalism to more modern liberal principles, certainly welfare capitalism, and moving towards a welfare state. The first question that you have on your chapter 6 uh, assignment deals with a quote from Roosevelt, the so-called square deal. Make sure you analyze it like you would analyze a source. Okay, so make sure you interpret the source, you deconstruct it, you would talk about people that would support it, oppose it, how it would link to liberalism. Does this relate to liberalism? Does it challenge it? Does it reject it? Does it accept it? In what way specifically? Okay. I'm not sure what this link is. Once again, I feel a little reticent to click on the links. You can certainly do that on your own. It might be a silly song. Sometimes I put silly songs in there, and I'm more than likely this is going to be a silly song. Yep, about Teddy Roosevelt sung to the song 24, I don't know, something magic. Yeah, yeah. You can watch that on your own if you feel so, um, if you feel so warranted or whatever. All right. Next set of slides here. The beauty of this is that if you get tired of my so-called monotone voice, over time you can do a couple things. One, you can skip over this entirely. Two, you can kind of skip to the parts where you feel like you need a little help with. Three, you can actually speed up my voice so that it is not so low and monotone. I'll actually speak a lot faster. Okay, so there's lots of nice things you can do with video. So anyways, so quick question, why did a progressive third party not develop in America? Where there were a number of reasons why progressivism actually stunted a little bit in the latter parts of the 1910s. Well, one was World War One. Okay, governments became not preoccupied, but preoccupied with the war effort. I don't know why I've never changed that. You know what? I'm going to change that right now. It's bugging me. And then we'll get right back to this. Changed. All right. You had the first Red Scare. I had briefly mentioned the Winnipeg General Strike, how it went against the workers. And one of the reasons why it went against the workers, because there was just this huge sentiment at the time that we cannot go left. If Russia can go left and turn into a communist country, what would stop us, being Canada, the United States, from turning left? Okay. Well, the answer is that Russia was in a much more vulnerable situation state than North America. You know, they didn't have a history of democracy behind them. Things were much more dire in the midst of World War One over there than it was here, and so they did turn to communism. Whereas turning to communism in North America would have been a much more difficult venture. Do not get confused with the first Red Scare with the subsequent and probably the more famous Red Scare that occurred post World War II, the so-called McCarthyism. And we'll talk about McCarthyism when we get to the Cold War unit. All right. And then, like I said, there was a reaction against all this progressivism, progressive presidents, like I previously mentioned, you know, Taft and of course Roosevelt and you know, those presidents. And so when uh, World War One ended and these other presidents came into the presidency, they actually reacted. They went back to more laissez-faire type principles. You know, presidents like Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge, even Herbert Hoover. Those three presidents were mainly Republican and returned to more laissez-faire type principles. Okay, and their platforms, you know, going away from Woodrow Wilson, who was the president right prior to and during World War One, their platforms was isolationism, you know, get out of international entanglements, like get out of the League of Nations or not even join the League of Nations. Okay, America first, you know, let's protect our own and then reduce government involvement. So a lot of right shifting, so to speak. Okay, once again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Feel free to click on the links, but there was this move against anything that was collective in nature, anything modern, liberal in nature, because they thought it was just a slippery slope towards communism. And it's some of the same sentiments that are being portrayed by the right today, that if you engage in too much left-wing kind of rhetoric, that it is just eventually you're going to become communist. Okay, like I said, Warren G. Harding, and then subsequent presidents promise return to isolation, nativism, more laissez-faire principles. Okay. At this time, you think of the 1920s, the statement is the roaring 20s. Okay. heavy mass production and consumption. Okay, Henry Ford, for example, it was kind of his heyday in the 1920s, producing items like the Model T Ford. Okay, lots of mass production. The economy was booming in the 1920s. Okay. Like I said, we've talked about this, and let me just pause for a second. So this slide here just kind of deals with what welfare capitalism is. Again, I mean, a lot of this is just we've already talked about it, so I'm not going to spend any time on this slide. Okay, but when we think of welfare capitalism, how is it different than welfare state? Okay, well, the welfare state is welfare capitalism plus some other things like unemployment insurance, health care, workers' compensation, welfare, old age pension. Okay, so that's the welfare state. Welfare capitalism is mainly better conditions, treatment of workers, minimum wage, etc. All right, so when we talk about the welfare state, and when we're talking about the welfare state, we're talking, Franklin Roosevelt, the United States. We're talking about Canada, post Great Depression. Our modern Canadian government would be an example of the welfare state. What you're seeing right now in the news when people are being laid off and they're receiving emergency payments and unemployment insurance and all that, that's an example of coming from the welfare state. In Sweden, they use the term the cradle to the grave. Okay, the welfare state, in theory, is going to attempt to educate you, train you, protect you, hospitalize you from the moment you're born to the moment you die. And these are all examples of the welfare state. So, how did we get to the welfare state? When did it occur? Well, like I said, the big event that precipitated the rise of the welfare state was the Great Depression. Okay. Problems that arose during this period made it obvious, at least from a more modern liberal perspective, that the existing political, economic, and social orders had failed. What began to emerge, as we know today, as the so called welfare state. So, once again, a little bit of a history lesson. The Roaring Twenties, the United States was the richest country in the world, vast amounts of resources, and a population that was a hardworking, resilient group of people. After World War I, the US became wealthy by mass producing consumer goods, for example, like radios and cars. And people, at least initially, were buying these so called radios and cars and many other items, of course. The United States and Canada also became the so-called breadbasket for Europe during World War I, and factory workers at the time were paid relatively well, which meant they spent their money on consumer goods. And I'm being very simplistic here. I mean, it's a lot more intricate than that, but I'm just kind of glossing over and hitting the high points. But what was the beginning of the end, the latter part of the 1920s? As the 1920s progressed, more and more people were buying shares and stocks of companies on the margin or on time. In other words, they would borrow money and use that money that they borrowed to invest in stocks and shares. Okay, so they were actually using not their money, but money that they had borrowed. And so they were taking lots of risks. Factories produced more goods than people could buy. Therefore, the supply of goods was much more than eventually the demand. Okay, so you continually churn things out and people are buying it, at least initially, but at some point there's a certain saturation of production and consumption, then people are going to no longer buy those items anymore. For example, cars and radios. You're not going to buy a car every couple of years or a radio every couple of years, for example. After World War I ended, America continued to produce large amounts of grain. When France began to produce grain again, well, because they weren't producing it during the war, because their whole bloody country was a battlefield. Eventually, the market became flooded and the price of grain plummeted. People, and I'm being very simplistic here. There's a lot of other factors here, but we were operating on a bubble, and it's somewhat similar to what was happening just before our stocks went down just recently. You get these bubbles. And sometimes these bubbles are artificially created, and at some point they have to, for a lack of a better word, burst. This slide just talks about this unregulated credit. Okay, there wasn't enough, maybe oversight, too much investment, too much speculation, not enough control on the stock market. Okay, and so some of these reasons eventually led to the crash of 1929, October 1929. But once again, this culminated with the Wall Street crash of October 1929. In 1929, share prices were rising, but profits for companies began to decline. By September and October, the market was fluctuating wildly. So days it would go way up and then go way down, up and down, and stuff like that. And then by latter part of October, uh, these prices started to really crash. On October 9th, the market really crashed. That day is known as Black Tuesday. And that crash eventually led to the Great Depression. There's just a few pictures showing how destitute people were. Once again, I mean, what is happening right now with the coronavirus, is very applicable to what happened in 1929. The large amount of people that are unemployed and without opportunities or chances of income, and the desperation that many people feel because of that. So there were other causes of this so-called Great Depression that occurred in North America from the latter part of the 1920s all the way through World War II. Supply outgrew demand, producing overproduction, eventually leading to falling prices. Okay, you had agricultural, you had droughts that destroyed crops. Wages did not increase and match inflation. Okay, so you would make the same amount of money, but the price of goods would go up. And so you could no longer afford those items as much as you previously did. Farmers went bankrupt, banks failed, people would pull their money out of banks, and eventually the banks would no longer have money to uh, give to people that had put money in there, and so banks would fail. Factories would close, and if factories closed, then workers no longer had money, and then the workers could no longer pay for items, and then businesses would fail. There was an increase in unemployment, lots of corporate fraud, and this cycle would continue over and over and over. By 1931, unemployed people were lining up in bread lines since there was no unemployment insurance. There was no uh, social security. There was no welfare state. Countries used protective tariffs, barriers, quotas, taxes in an attempt to protect their own industries. And that further slowed things down internationally. By 1932, 12 million people in the United States, almost 1/4 of the workforce, was unemployed. The president at that time, Hoover, feared that assistance from government would make citizens dependent and unable to stand on their own 2 feet. In 1932, the American people voted in a new president, Franklin Roosevelt, who promised support, promised some sort of intervention. Okay, and so when we think of the advent of the welfare state, we think of Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. Now, Roosevelt was inspired by and used some of the principles of this next individual, and his name was John Maynard Keynes. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about Keynes. You can kind of do the reading on that, but he used the principles that he talked about. Now, Keynes, if I was going to put him somewhere on the spectrum, I'd put him in the area of a modern liberal. He certainly wasn't a collectivist, and he certainly wasn't a basic laissez-faire capitalist. He believed that to use the power of government in intervening in the economy to bring about more stable economy. Okay, so we'll talk about that here in a second. But when we think of John Maynard Keynes, we think of the term demand side economics. Classical liberals, which Keynes was not, believed that there would be full employment when supply and demand were in balance. They also believed that the natural law of economics was that good times were followed by bad times. That sounds like a lead. Therefore, it was an individual's responsibility to save for bad times during periods of prosperity. Quick question. Who saves for bad times? Most of us don't. We're all kind of in trouble right now, living paycheck to paycheck, stuff like that. So Keynes recognized that most of us were just scraping by. We didn't save for the bad times. Okay. Keynes argued that the economy was unstable and people reacted in times of uncertainty by hoarding money, thereby harming the economy. Okay, so when we think of Keynes, we think of the term demand side economics. Okay, let's create consumer demand in order to kickstart the economy. Okay, another term for that type of economics would be Keynesian economics. So let's have a look at that. Because few people could predict the variances of the market. So, like, who saw this coronavirus coming and who saw that the market would tank more than, maybe a month or two ago, people could start seeing this happening. But really, after that, I don't see many people that could see this coming. He proposed a solution to this problem through the regulation of government spending, taxation, regulation of interest rates, and the production of money. This is called demand side economics. I'm going to skip this. All right, let's have a look at this slide because this is very important. And this is him in a nutshell. So we're going through a recession and most likely we're going to hit a depression. So Keynes would argue that when times are bad, that the government needs to increase government spending, which you see that they are. They would decrease your taxes. Okay, so lower your taxes, increase spending. And that's fiscal. That's what they do through their budgets. And then monetarily, they would increase the money supply, putting more money to the system, and they would decrease your interest rates. Okay, and so it would make it easier for you to borrow money. Okay, and so the whole thinking behind all of this is that we need to kickstart the economy. We need to give the consumer incentive in order to spend more money. So we need to kind of prime the pump, so to speak. All right, so that's what we do when things are bad. Now, conversely, when things are good, we do the exact opposite. Okay, because what happens when you do all those things when times are bad, your country is going to run into a number of deficits and you're going to create debt. Okay, because you're going to be spending more than you're bringing in through taxation. You increase your spending, decrease your taxes, you're going to create debt. Okay, so you have to find a way to recoup that at some point. So when times are good, you do the opposite. You decrease spending, you increase taxes, you decrease money supply, you increase interest rates. Okay. Problem with this side here is that good luck getting reelected on that platform. Good luck running a platform that says we're going to increase your taxes because things are too good right now. We're going to decrease spending. And so historically, in the last 50, 60 years, we've run more and more deficits, more and more debt. And the resulting is that, both our country and the United States are heavily in debt. So here's a couple diagrams that show the standard business cycle. You have your boom and bust cycles. And then, of course, if you're making more money as a country, you're going to collect more in taxes. Okay, so the blue line is the boom and bust cycles. You have your booms and you have your busts, and then you have your taxes collected because people are making more, so you're going to collect more in taxes. So this is how Keynes suggested that you would overcome this boom and bust cycle. You would spend more when times are bad, and you would spend less when times are good. And so it would even it out. It's like if you had a bunch of hot water, if you put a bunch of cold water in, you would have more just warm water. And so the result would be instead of the boom and bust, the highs and lows, you'd have this steady creep, okay, over time. And that's the basic Keynesian kind of model. So how did this play out in real life? Well, Franklin Roosevelt started all these New Deal propositions, all these New Deal programs. Okay, so he put people to work by building roads, building dams, creating national and state parks, fighting forest fires, planting trees, creating infrastructure. Okay, so that money would come from the government. They would pay the workers, and the thinking was, we're going to pay the workers. They're going to have money in their pockets. They're going to be a little more content. They're going to use that money in their pockets to buy things, purchase items, and that's going to provide money to stores. Stores are going to provide for their own employees. They're going to buy from factories. Factories are going to employ people. Those people are going to have money, and the pump is going to be prime, so to speak. So here's just some pictures of these so-called make work programs. These guys here are planting trees. I'm not sure what these guys are doing. They're picking rocks. You can see that. These guys are building, and these guys are probably all waiting to see if they can get a job for that day. So when we think of some of these make work projects during the New Deal, a phrase that was coined during that time was called the alphabet agencies, because all these agencies had acronyms behind them: the WPA, the CCC, the NWA, the PWA, TVA, so to speak. Okay, he called all these make work type of projects. The big umbrella term was the New Deal. And the New Deal was an example of a shift of the United States from the welfare capitalist country to now the welfare state. Feel free to click on these links. I'm not going to do that today. I mean, let's see which ones are good. Hi, I'm John. We got the New Deal from Crash Course. We have, I'm not sure what that one is. That didn't look like anything. I think this is a silly song. It is. Silly song. If you're going to watch any of them, watch this one. This one's history brief. It's only about 4 minutes long. Maybe the one on the top. Whatever. Okay. So in review, you see this shift from classical liberalism to more modern liberalism. You can see where they kind of fit on a spectrum. You got welfare capitalism. Welfare state would be more, a little bit to the left of that. Okay. So in review, we have classical liberalism. You have it in theory. You have it in practice. Came out with the Industrial Revolution. Eventually, there was opposition to liberalism from these various groups. Reaction by liberals. We've looked at welfare capitalism. We looked at the welfare state. We've even looked at Keynesian economics. And so that's it, my friends. That's it for the rest of chapter 4. I think one of these days here in the next couple days, I'll do another video that deals just with chapter 6. So anyways, get your chapter 4 assignment in as soon as possible and use these videos, where you can. If you don't need to use them, that's fine. If you just want to look at the Google Slides, that's fine. But I felt compelled to provide this service for you. And, fire me some suggestions if you want a certain suggestion on how you want me to present these or whatever. I can do that too. And like I said, look forward to hearing from you. Make sure you get your assignments in. Once again, the new mandate, and like I said, it's fluid. It changes from day to day, week to week. Is now that your mark can go down if you are able to get work in, and you're not getting work in. I mean, we've only been in class for a month and a half. I mean, if you want your credits for Social 30, you have to learn more of that content. So I'm going to cut down the content. I'm going to cut down the work. For example, in this chapter 6 assignment, you can work on it on your own, or you can just work on it in a partnership. Okay, you can kind of do a Google Doc kind of partner assignment with somebody. I don't care. okay, as long as you learn the content. So good to hear from you, and I'll see you again in a couple days. All right, take care.